What's up guys, Dr. Joey here. Today we're going to talk about how to select exercises for your training program if your main goal is just to build a ton of muscle, aka hypertrophy. Alright, let's get right into it. First, it's important to understand that there are no must-do exercises for hypertrophy. No matter what anyone tells you, you don't have to bench to get a bigger chest or barbell squat to get big legs. Trust me, I used to think this was true, but it really isn't. Instead, there are some general rules that you want to follow whenever you're selecting exercises for hypertrophy. The first and most important rule may seem obvious, but it's that you feel the exercise targeting the muscles that you're trying to target. For example, if you're trying to grow your quads by doing a barbell back squat, you should feel a ton of tension and even a burning sensation in your quads when you're performing squats. If you do 3 or 4 sets of squats and your lower back is super pumped and fatigued and your quads don't really feel that tired, then the barbell back squat may not be the most effective exercises to grow the quads for you. That doesn't mean that the squat isn't an effective exercise for growing the quads. It just means that it may not be the best exercise to grow the quads for you due to your leverages, muscle weaknesses, or technique. On top of feeling tension during the exercise, the target muscles should also feel pumped and fatigued after doing a couple of sets of that exercise. Of course, feeling a pump isn't necessarily an indicator that you're growing muscle, but if the target muscles are pumped after you finish a set, then it is a pretty good indicator that that exercise is effectively targeting that muscle. The next thing you need to consider is how much growth stimulus an exercise provides compared to how much fatigue it produces. Now, these two variables, fatigue and stimulus, are impossible to objectively measure, but there are some subjective measures that can give you a good indicator of how effective an exercise is for growth. All of the indicators that we just talked about, tension, pump, fatigue, and a burning sensation, are good indicators that an exercise is providing a good growth stimulus. If there's 2 different exercises in your training, both of the exercises with the same intensity and the same rep ranges, and yet one of them provides a ton more tension and a better muscle pump, then it's likely providing a better stimulus for growth than the other exercise. Besides stimulus though, we also need to consider fatigue. There's no doubt that some exercises take more out of you and leave you feeling more beat up than others. The amount of mental focus required, joint stress, and systemic fatigue produced by an exercise are all variables that contribute to fatigue. For example, if you need to put on your favorite song, get slapped in the back, and snort some smelling salts before getting ready for a super heavy set of squats, you're gonna feel drained and fatigued afterwards, which will probably negatively impact your performance during the rest of your workout. If that's you, your leg day shouldn't just be 10 sets of squats if your goal is to maximize muscle growth. You'd be both mentally and physically fried, you probably wouldn't be able to optimally recover from session to session, and you'd probably be hindering your long-term progress. You have to find a balance between how many difficult, fatiguing exercises and easier, less fatiguing exercises you include in your training. You'd get just an effective stimulus for growth doing 2 or 3 sets of squats, some leg press, and some leg extensions, and feel way less strained than performing 10 hard sets of squats in a single session. Another important thing to consider is how much joint stress an exercise causes. For example, if you know that if you bench too often your elbow starts to hurt, then the majority of your pressing movements for your chest shouldn't come from the bench press if your goal is to maximize hypertrophy. You'd be much better off relying on an exercise that causes you significantly less joint stress. For example, if you can dumbbell press for days on end with minimal joint discomfort, then that's probably going to be a better option for hypertrophy than the barbell bench press, which causes you pain when you overdo it. Again, I'm not saying that you shouldn't bench press. Every single person is different. Some people feel fantastic with a barbell bench press, get an amazing stimulus in their chest, and never feel joint discomfort. If that's you, then by all means, bench as much as you want. Okay. These are the main factors to consider when deciding whether you should include an exercise in your training for hypertrophy. If an exercise doesn't drain you mentally or physically, doesn't hurt your joints if you perform it too often, gives you amazing tension in the muscles that you're trying to target, and leaves them feeling fatigued and pumped after several sets, then it's probably a pretty good exercise for growing that target muscle. As I'm sure you've noticed, I'm being pretty vague here, not talking about specific exercises because it is different for every single person. You need to go through a period of trial and error and find what exercises work for you. Now, all of these variables that we've talked about so far are cute indicators of whether or not a particular exercise is good for hypertrophy. In other words, they tell you whether or not you should include these exercises in your program right now. But we also need to talk about indicators that tell you whether or not you should keep an exercise in your training or whether you should substitute it with something else over time. Before we get into those, really quick though, if you're enjoying this video so far, I'd really appreciate if you help me out by hitting the like button and subscribing to my channel so you don't miss any of my future content. Thanks. Okay, when deciding whether you should keep an exercise or substitute it with something else, you need to consider whether or not the exercise is still providing the same kind of stimulus that it did when you first started doing it. For example, 3 months ago, the bench press may have given you a really good stimulus for your chest, but for some reason, a couple of months later, it just starts to feel stale and you're not getting the same quality tension and pump in the chest that you once used to. That's a good indicator that it's probably a good idea to change up that exercise for a period of time. These things happen, and instead of continuously hammering the bench press, it's probably best to switch to another movement that feels really good on your chest and focus on that new movement for a period of time. The second variable to consider is progressive overload. At the end of the day, you have to make progress in terms of your performance, aka more reps, more weight, or a combination of both, in order to assure that you're growing muscle. If there's a particular exercise that for some reason you haven't really made much progress in over the past 2 or 3 months, it's probably a good idea to substitute it with something else. It doesn't matter if you're getting a really good pump or really good tension in the target muscle. If you're using the same weights and performing the same number of reps as you were 2 or 3 months ago, then that exercise is probably not providing much stimulus for growth. Okay, I know I've thrown a lot at you at this video so far, so I quickly want to take a second to summarize everything. If you want to know if an exercise is either a yay or a nay for muscle growth, ask yourself these questions. 1, do I feel a lot of tension in the target muscle? And does the target muscle feel fatigued and pumped after a set? If the answer is yes, then it's likely a pretty good exercise for hypertrophy. 2, ask yourself, do I need to get crazy amped up for this exercise, or can I just walk into the gym on any given day and perform pretty well? If you have to get super amped up, it's probably not the best idea to heavily rely on that exercise for growth. I know that for me, I have to get extremely hyped up to do a heavy set of squats, whereas I can pretty much just walk into the gym and do a hard set of leg presses, even if I'm not really feeling it that day. Lastly, ask yourself whether the exercise causes a ton of joint stress. If your joints typically feel a bit beat up after you do the exercises for 3 or 4 weeks in a row, then maybe it's probably not a good idea to heavily rely on that exercise either, and find alternatives that feel better on your joints. Alrighty guys, that's gonna wrap it up for this video. By the way, this video was heavily inspired by Mike Israetel of Renaissance Periodization. He's a freaking wizard when it comes to all things hypertrophy, so make sure to go check out his channel. Catch you guys in next week's video. Peace!